Hey everybody, it's Omni. One of the defining features of any Omnified game is the Apocalypse system. So what is the Apocalypse system? Back during the very early days of me Omnifying games, one question that I had to answer was, what exactly about the game was I going to change? Well, with the goal being to increase deaths and make the game more challenging, the answer was clear. The very first sort of changes I made to a game were changes to how damage worked in each game that I played, so that a single hit from an enemy would kill my ass. This was very fun to do, and the resulting gameplay was excruciatingly awesome as well. Over time, I would make things a bit more complicated, add a few more conditions to how various damages being done were being handled, etc. Making it so you would get one shot by everything in games was neat and all. But one important goal for me is that for each game, I try to do something new and different, something that improves on my previous creations. After many months into my Omnification career, I finally figured out how to harness the powers of randomness in the assembly code I was writing. I started to be able to generate random effects based on random dice rolls. It wasn't too long after that, during some of the Omnification of Resident Evil 3, but mainly the Omnification of Middle-earth Shadow of War, that I created a system where, upon the player being hit, dice would be rolled and random effects would occur. This was then cemented into Omni history by the introduction of a stream display of the various dice rolls, along with flavor text for each of the effects, all presented to the viewer so they knew exactly what was going on in this new weird world of add-on game mechanics. Thus, the Apocalypse system was born. It is a game-neutral system that is inserted into a game's damage calculation system that completely replaces it. Game neutral means that the Apocalypse system code has been written so that it literally works with any game that I plug it into. I literally have a library of assembly code that I can simply paste into some hacking code I'm working on for a game, and it freaking works. No changes required to it. I was really psyched when I devised a way I could take this game-changing code and structure it in a way that would make it work with any game. All game-specific data is provided in the form of parameters that are dictated by the design. It then provides feedback to the game it's hooked into through the use of one or more return values. So that means the only work I have to do for each game now is writing the code that initiates the system. You can see how I do this for a particular game by looking at my hacking log for that game, specifically a hacking log covering the Apocalypse system. But simply put, it's a minimal amount of code that I have to write for each game so we can get it into a new game in the minimal amount of time. Saving time with this allows me to add even newer, crazier things to games. So how does the Apocalypse system change gameplay? Well, there are two major components to the Apocalypse system. You have first the player Apocalypse. This handles damage being done to the player. You then have the second component, the enemy Apocalypse. This handles damage being done to enemies by the player. So let's start with the player Apocalypse. When the player is hit by an enemy, a 10-sided die is cast. If the die lands on values 1 through 4, an extra amount of damage is done. That extra amount of damage is defined per game in the variable extra damage X, but typically it is around 2 times damage, whatever I feel is the most balanced. If the die lands on values 5 to 6, the player is hit with what is known as teleportitis. This term derives from the true roguelike NetHack, of which I have the 64th highest score in the world for, where the player would teleport randomly around the map for a bit when they had a status with the same name. Basically, the player has a random plus or minus 5 unit offset applied to their X, Y, and Z axes. This is after they suffer normal damage. This causes a disorientating effect and can also kill the character in some hilarious way. A parameter exists called negative vertical displacement enabled, and when it is enabled, it'll allow for the player to be teleported beneath the ground. This can be quite hilarious if it occurs in some games where you die when that happens, but I have it toggleable so you can turn it off in games that it doesn't work in. In some games, you just fall forever. If a 7 to 9 value is rolled, another die roll is cast, known as the risk of murder roll. This is a 5-sided die, and when that gets rolled, there's a risk for, murder. If it lands on 1 to 3, the player gets normal damage. If it lands on 4 to 5, the player gets smacked with 69 times damage done. AKA, the player gets 69'd. Nothing is sweeter than that sweet 69, baby. In the games I'm playing, you know, yeah. Finally, if a 10 is rolled on the original diecast, the player receives a spontaneous orgasm, which heals them to full health. Because you know, that's what would happen in real life if you were to have an orgasm on the battlefield. So to make it even more interesting, all of this stuff gets outputted to something I call the Apocalypse event log. This is displayed at the top of the stream, so people know exactly what is happening behind the scenes. It makes those 69 moments extra special, baby. Finally, the player Apocalypse component also tracks some in-game stats to be displayed on the stream, like how much damage the player is doing. The enemy apocalypse basically takes over if the player hits an enemy. The goal of Omnification is to make the game harder, not easier. So we don't get a 12% chance of inflicting 69 times damage on the enemy or anything like that. Basically, the enemy apocalypse, much like the player apocalypse, keeps track of certain in-game stats, in particular stats that deal with damage being done to the enemies. It also introduces critical damage for the player. Basically, the player has a 6.25% chance to critically hit an enemy, and if they do, the damage is a random amount between 2 times to 5 times or something. All of this will be reported to viewers on the event log if it happens. If you can't tell, I love RNG, baby. One other fun thing the enemy apocalypse does is give the player, on very rare occasions, the ability to perform a Kamehameha, which does 10,000 times damage to the enemy. The chance for it to go off, however, is about 1 in 5,000. It depends on my mood for the day. This will also be reported to viewers when it happens. These things seem like kind of big buffs for the player, and they are nice, but they don't go off that often, and it is just to make things a little less grim in face of the terrifying realities of the Omnified experience. That's basically what the Apocalypse system does. It basically reworks how damage is handled in the game, and gives us juicy servings of randomized 69 times flavored death. You know a game has it if you see the event log at the top of the stream. So pay attention to that if you do. For the last part of this video, for the people who are truly interested, we're gonna take a quick peek at the code and see what that looks like. Everybody, we're gonna take a look now at the Apocalypse system code. You can find some formal documentation on how the Apocalypse system works, such as the parameter requirements and all that. Click on the link below in the description. Here's the player Apocalypse system function. This would be called when the player is receiving some damage, and we need to calculate what the updated damage amount should be. The name of this function is execute player apocalypse. This is what you would actually call from your code. As you can see here, it requires 4 different parameters. The first parameter you push to the stack is the damage amount. This is gonna be in the form of a floating point value. And it's gonna be the initial damage that the game wants to inflict on the character. And it is the crux of the entire apocalypse system. The next parameter is the player's health. This is actually just the value for the player's health in floating point form. Does not need to be an address to the struct that contains the player's health. This will be used for read purposes. This will be used as a reference if we need to update the player's health as a function of the outcome of the roll. In particular, if we experience the sudden-gasm. Third is the max player's health amount. This, just like the player's health, is the value for what the player's health would be if it was maxed out. I guess I should add amount there. This is used if a player gets a sudden-gasm, since they are fully healed. The last parameter passed is the player's coordinates. Now this needs to be aligned at the x-coordinate, and so it'll be a sequence of the 3 coordinates. It'll be the x-coordinate in floating point form, the y-coordinate, and the z-coordinate. Each coordinate will be sized at 4 bytes, the standard floating point size. Since they are typically always next to each other in memory for virtually every game I've ever played, this is a safe bet that we won't be violating the game neutrality of the function by expecting this as a parameter. This is used for teleportitis outcomes. One feature of the Apocalypse system that we didn't discuss earlier on is the fact that I actually have a God mode added to it. If a game has the Apocalypse system added to it, I can enable God mode with the flick of a switch. Let's actually see how we would do that. The symbol that it looks at is player God mode. If we want to add support for the player God mode in our game, we just need to set the symbol to be 1. You can either just add an address manually here, have it set to player God mode. Then once you OK it, you can manually set it to 1 when you want, or we can just write an easy script that changes it. This will be a separate script from the main Omnified script, so I'll have an enable disable section. And we just change the directive here for player God mode to be 1 instead of 0, which is what it is by default. And then when we disable it, we want to obviously reset that value. Assign to current cheat table. Enable God mode. Here we are playing the game. As you see, I'm getting smacked around, and you should see the Apocalypse log updating. It's a teleportitis effect right there. So you can see that we're going to stop taking damage as soon as I enable that God mode that's built into the player Apocalypse system. We got it checked. Let's see if we can get a... Let's see if we take any damage now. Feel like hitting me today, buddy? For the purposes of this video, please attack me. Any day now. Please. Please attack me. As you can see, we were hit and no damage was done. Don't worry though, I would never ever turn on God mode and cheat during a live gameplay stream. Never. So at the very top of the function here, we load our parameters into some backed up SSE registers. XMM3 will be set to the value that the player's health should be following the conclusion of this function here. Just in case we need to update the player's health as opposed to updating the damage amount. Like, for example, if the gasm roll occurs, XMM0 will contain the damage being done to the player. We first do a comparison between the damage being done and a damage threshold, which I think I have set to either 0 or 2. And it's just to weed out all the damage calls that occur with the damage of 0 happening. In games, I've noticed it's quite common for these damage functions to go off even when there's no damage being done to the player. And so we just filter that out here just so we don't have a unnecessary roll occurring. We then check for our God mode value here. If the God mode is set, we simply XOR the SSE registers containing the damage being done to the player, which will result in an updated damage value of 0 being returned. Therefore, 0 damage will be done to the player. And then we exit out of the function. Otherwise, we actually apply the apocalypse. The first thing we do is we generate a random number that is going to basically simulate the rolling of a 10-sided die. The generate random number is also a assembly function I've written that is part of this common Omnified assembly library. And it works by pushing a lower bounds to the random number to the stack, then the upper bounds, and then another value that indicates whether or not the random number system has been initialized for the particular piece of code yet. Future improvement for this function here will be not to require a third parameter, but instead check the thread information block and see if the current thread has ever had its random number system initialized, since it needs to be per thread. However, that will require working with arrays and such, and assembling, that's not too fun. But we'll get to it. It's very simple here then. The result of the random number generation will be in the EAX register, so we just compare that against our roll outcomes. If it's 1 through 4, it's extra damage. 5 through 6, that teleportitis goes off. If it's 7 through 9, we do a risk or murder roll. Otherwise, we gasm, baby. Extra damage is very simple. We just multiply the damage being done by the extra damage. Remember, this is set to a default of 2. It'll be tweaked based on what game we're playing. Here's the teleportitis section. This is going to randomly apply a plus or minus 5 unit change to the player's X, Y, and Z axes. So we're basically going to generate 3 separate random numbers. 1 for the X, 1 for the Y, 1 for the Z. So we have to call generate random number again. The way that we do it with the teleportitis roll is we want to generate between plus or minus 5, correct? Well, with the random number generation functions that we use that are part of the OS, the rand function, you can only generate an unsigned integer. So what we need to do is basically have enough latitude in our range of values so that we can eventually convert it to a floating point and then divide it by a certain divisor to get it within the proper range of values while maintaining that extra resolution we get with some decimal points. Meaning that I can generate a random number between 0 and 10,000, which is what I think I do here. Divide that number by 1,000, which will give me a random value between 0 and 10, and up to 3 decimal places. So I can get like 2.03, 2.045, that kind of thing. In some games that can make a big difference. So, and then of course to get it to plus or minus 5, we then shift it then by -5. So then it'll be plus or minus 5. So what we do here, arm those lower and upper bounds. We then convert it to a floating point, divide it by that divisor, which brings it in line with what the expected range of values is supposed to be, and then shift it. We also have a teleportitis displacement X, and this will normally always be set to 1, because normally plus or minus 5 units in a coordinate system for a game makes a pretty noticeable difference for the character. But in some games, it does not. For example, in this Monster Hunter World game, if I move my character 5 units, you wouldn't even see the difference. You have to multiply it by quite a bit in order to see a difference, which is not the standard in games. Typically, moving a step forward or so is going to be, 1 or 2 on the axes. In this game, moving this far ahead is like 200. So, also within the code here, we have the option to be able to skip negative vertical displacement. So that then will force the plus or minus going to the y-axis to be 0 to 10 and not -5 to +5. This is to avoid issues with some games that you might get if you fall through the ground. That's pretty much it there. Risk of murder is just another roll, basically, and if it's between 1 and 3, it'll not do anything, normal damage. Otherwise, if it's 4 to 5, we'll get that 69 outcome, or just multiply it by 69. Otherwise, with the Sungasm, we use XOR out the XMM0 register, so no damage being done. And then we just set the health that the player's health should be set to at the conclusion of this function to be what their max health is. So that's all the rolls and outcomes in the Apocalypse function. The final thing that it's responsible for is updating enemy damage specific statistics, as in damage being done by enemies. And we keep track of the max damage done to the player for the session, the last damage being done to the player. So that attack that just occurred. Set the log apocalypse flag to 1 to signal to the messaging system that there needs to be a new event to print out to the stream. That's it for the player apocalypse. Enemy apocalypse system function is a bit simpler, I suppose. This applies a player damage multiplier to the damage, which is by default 1, but if I feel like cheating, I can set it to whatever I want, and the player will do that much more damage. Here we have the crit chance roll occurring. Basically, it's going to generate a random number between 1 through 400, and then it's going to see if the result is 25 or less. If it is 25 or less, then that should mean that we hit that 6.25% crit chance that occurs, and we do another roll for the damage to apply. And here's that lovely Kamehameha. We got the Goku result lower and upper. Typically, this will be set to occur 1 in 5,000 times. That's where it should roll here, a random number between 1 and 5,000. If it's 69, then we win and get 10,000 times damage. Finally, we just update the player damage stats here. Max damage by the player for the session, and the last damage by the player, and then a total damage by the player for the whole session, which is neat. Another thing that's cool here is that since we have access to it, we grab the enemy's current health value, and that gets displayed on the screen, which is neat for games that don't tell you what the enemy's health is. So that's the common assembly functions that we would copy and paste into a game. Here's an example of the initiation of those systems. And this was all the code I need to write in order to get this functionality into a new game. Basically, I just need to find those parameters and then push them to the stack and then call the Apocalypse function. And that's basically it. Hope you guys enjoyed that. I'll be putting up videos that cover my other systems I've created for Omnified games. Till then though, if you want to support this truly unique content, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and follow my Twitch stream, which is where the live gameplay of this Omnified content will occur. Have a good day.